let's get started here. Like Barbara told you about my background, I served in the military and worked at General Motors, been at Corning for 10 years. And I just put this slide up here so you can see that it's a lot of things that come along with me, right? I'm from a small town in Northeast Ohio. You know, I have a loving husband, I have one daughter. You see the picture of the church, Friendship Baptist Church. That's something that's important to me. This slide just kind of represents what's going on in my life now. You see the City of Corning sign, the sheriff's sign because of my work with police reform. And then you see my sorority, you know, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And you see all these things about voting, because all these things I think are just a little bit of who I am and represent the things that's important to me, okay? So before we get started, I'm gonna go through a list of a few things I would like everyone on the line to consider, okay? Because we are talking about a touchy subject here, right? So just remember that a strong opinion is not the same as informed knowledge. There is a difference between agreement and understanding, especially when discussing institutional dynamics such as racism. Consider whether I don't agree may mean if I don't understand, right? Because sometimes people may not agree with something, but it may be because they simply don't understand it. So keep that in mind. Racism goes beyond individual intentions to collective group patterns, right? It's not so much about the individual as a person or what they've done or what they are doing or saying, but think about it as a whole of what they may have experienced in their life from being a part of a certain group, okay? And we don't have to be aware of racism in order for it to exist, because some people may not have been exposed to it, right? And then putting our effort into protecting rather than expanding our current world view, right? So as you learn and hear different things in here, instead of being defensive and trying to protect maybe why you feel a certain way, maybe just think of it as enlightenment in your learning and expanding your own worldview, okay? All right, and like I said earlier before we started, this is an interactive engagement. We have the chat box. Even though I can't see it, Marshall can see it. So if certain things are going on in there or questions or comments, Marshall, please let me know. Because when I go into this presentation mode, I can't see it. But we want people to feel engaged and feel like they can express themselves, because that's really, truly, you know, what a lot of this book is about. You know, through so much of our history in America, people haven't always felt comfortable to do that, right? So we don't want to keep that going here. We want to change it, right? So before we get started, I'll tell you a little bit about the author. Her name is DiAngelo. She is an American author and academic lecturer. She's a consultant and a trainer. So she travels all around the country and world talking about this subject of racism, right? She has more than 20 years experience. Before I read this book, I had not heard of her, but then after I researched her, she has quite a few books that have been on the bestsellers list. So I was very impressed. So as a diversity consultant, she argues that whites in America must face the racist bias implanted in them by a racist society. Their resistance to acknowledging this, she maintains, constitutes a white fragility, and that they must overcome in order for meaningful progress on both interpersonal and societal racism to happen. So this is a book written by a white woman, and the book was actually written to white people. So I don't know how many of you guys on the line have actually read the book, but when you read it, it's obvious, and she says it, you know, she's writing it to white people, but I think it's so much in here for all of us to learn. And she has a lot of experience, and it's just not about what she thinks. Is based on studies, research, and all of that. So please keep in mind as we go through the slides, I am just recanting and sharing what knowledge was shared in this book, okay? Okay, let's start off with a little video. It's 3 minutes long, about 3.5 minutes long. Let's see. Can you turn it up? The winner of this race will take this. It's $100 bill.
couple statements. If those statements apply to you, I want you to take 2 steps forward. If those statements don't apply to you, I want you to stay right where you're at. Take 2 steps forward if both of your parents are still married. Take 2 steps forward if you grew up with a father figure in the home. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a private education. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a free tutor growing up. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to worry about your cell phone being shut off. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to help mom or dad with the bills. Take 2 steps forward if it wasn't because of your athletic ability, you don't have to pay for college. Take 2 steps forward if you never wondered where your next meal was going to come from. I want you guys up here in the front just to turn around and look. Every statement I've made has nothing to do with anything any of you have done. Has nothing to do with decisions you've made. Everything I've said has nothing to do with what you've done. We all know these people up here have a better opportunity to win this $100. Does that mean these people back here can't race? No. We would be foolish to not realize we've been given more opportunity. We don't want to recognize that we've been given a head start. But the reality is we have. Now, there's no excuse. They still got to run their race. You still got to run your race. But whoever wins this $100, I think it'd be extremely foolish of you not to utilize that and learn more about somebody else's story. Because the reality is, if this was a fair race and everybody was back on that line, I guarantee you some of these black people smoke all of you. And it's only because you have this big of a head start that you're possibly going to win this race called life. That is a picture of life, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing you've done has put you in the lead that you're in right now. When I say go, on your mark, get set, go.
So now can you see my screen again? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, I just wanted to start off with that as a little, icebreaker or visual reflection into the subject that we're going to talk about. That particular video, it kind of brings up and sums up what this book is about, right? In the chat box, please put in there what feelings you felt by watching that video. What is your reaction? Were some of you surprised? Or did you pretty much already know that? What are your thoughts about that? Right? So while you're chatting, I would like Marshall to put up a poll question. And it says, how many of you are afraid to talk about race? Right? How many of us on this call today are afraid to talk about race with people that don't look like us? Have you ever even done it? Give you a few more seconds. Few more seconds, because this may be some people's first time using the poll tool. Okay, Marshall, what do we have there?
We have 0 responses.
No, that it's there.
I don't see any.
Oh, we see it now, Marshall. We see it.
Okay.
So it said, are you afraid to talk about race with people outside your ethnic group? 38% said yes, and 62% said no. Okay, those numbers are, the no is much higher than we anticipated, but that's good. So that means we'll have a lively discussion in our chat box here. Thank you, Marshall. Okay, so let's get into this book. So according to Robin, right, when she says the term white fragility, she describes it as a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include the outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving a stress-inducing situation. So what she's saying is, when, in her experience, when white people are confronted with topics of racism, they kind of clam up. They don't want to talk about it, and they get upset. And she's saying that these behaviors, in turn, function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. So it's almost, if we don't talk about it and we don't acknowledge it, then we don't have to deal with it, and therefore everything stays the same, right? And her book is primarily focused on raising the consciousness and increasing the cross-racial skills of white people. And when she says cross-racial skills, she's talking about interacting with others outside the race and understanding the things that they're going through, okay? So one of the key takeaways for me, which, you know, we only have 45 minutes to an hour, so I couldn't get into everything because it was so much in this book, I tell you. But one of the chapters talked about the challenges of talking to white people about racism. And she said how, like, white people feel so confident in their opinions on racism, even as they live lives in segregation. They tend to believe what they have always been taught and experienced is what it is, even though they haven't really had a chance to maybe interact with others outside their race. And she pointed out that white people in North America live in a social environment that protects and insulates them from race-based stress. So what she's saying is that as a white person, you could go to middle school, you can go to college, you can get a job in certain parts of the country and really never find yourself ever being forced to deal with certain subject of racism or deal with others that don't look like you. And she said this insulated environment of racial protection builds white expectations for racial comfort, while at the same time lowering the ability to tolerate racial stress. And that's where she gets her term, white fragility. And she consistently reiterated through the book that racism is a structure and not an event. Because sometimes in many people's mind, they look at it as a person saying something or doing something. And they sometimes don't think about the systemic structure that's in place that maybe has allowed it. So one question I wondered as I read this part of the book is, how many of us was, you know, raised in a household where we discussed race? How many of our parents really talked to us about race? So Marsha, will you put that poll question up so we can understand our audience here, how many people grew up with those type of conversations? And it's not just a conversation of it's us and them, we stick to our side, they have their side of town or their church, but really talking about what it means and its impact. Couple more seconds. Okay, Marshall, Louise, or Barbara, do we have the results? So it's pretty good split there. About 53% said yes, that it was discussed in the home, and 48% said no. And that's about what we expected there. Okay, so since this is a book review and this is a great book, I'm gonna read on page 4, right? It's a paragraph off of page 4 that I think really says a lot here. And this is Robin speaking. She says, I came to see that the way we are taught to define racism makes it virtually impossible for white people to understand it. Given our racial installation coupled with misinformation, any suggestion that we are complicit in racism is a kind of unwelcome and insulting shock to the system. If, however, I understand racism as a system into which I was socialized, I can receive feedback on my problematic racial patterns as a helpful way to support my learning and growth. One of the greatest social fears for a white person is being told that something we have said or done is racially problematic. Yet, when someone lets us know that we have done just such a thing, rather than respond with gratitude and relief, we often respond with anger and denial. Such moments can be experienced as something valuable, even if temporarily painful, only after we accept that racism is unavoidable and that it is impossible to completely escape, having developed problematic racial assumptions and behaviors. None of the white people whose actions I describe in this book would identify as racist. In fact, they will most likely identify as racially progressive and deny any complicity with racism. Yet all their responses illustrate their white fragility and how it holds racism in place. These responses spur the daily frustrations and indignities people of color endure from white people who see themselves as open-minded and thus not racist. This book is intended for us, for white progressives who so often, despite our conscious intentions, make life so difficult for people of color. I believe that white progressives cause the most damage to people of color. I define white progressives as white people who think they are not racist or are less racist or in the choir or already get it. So you see, she starts off with just very strong language. And put in the chat box, how did you feel about that? What was your thoughts? Because I know just me reading the book, you know, hearing a white woman speak like this and say these things that I may sometimes hear in other conversations with African Americans, it was interesting and surprising. But it was refreshing that she could somewhat understand some of the things that we feel and just write them so eloquently. So share your thoughts with that. So the next thing that kind of stood out to me is that to understand racism, you must also understand prejudice and discrimination. And she talked about how if we think about how our own understanding of these differences would better inform our thoughts and actions. And I have a misspelling there. So for that, I go to page 22. So, and I'll read you a little bit about that. It says, racism is deeply embedded in the fabric of our society. It is not limited to a single act or person, nor does it move back and forth, one day benefiting whites and another day benefiting people of color. The direction of power between white people and people of color is historic, traditional, and normalized in ideology. Racism differs from individual racial prejudice and racial discrimination and the historical accumulation and ongoing use of institutional power and authority to support the prejudice and to systemically enforce discriminatory behaviors with far-reaching effects. People of color may also hold prejudices and discriminate against white people, but they lack the social and institutional power that transforms their prejudice and discrimination into racism. The impact of their prejudice on whites is temporary and contextual. Whites hold the social and institutional positions in society to infuse their racial prejudice into the laws, policies, practices, and norms of society in a way that people of color do not. A person of color may refuse to wait on me if I enter a shop, but people of color cannot pass legislation that prohibits me and everyone like me from buying a home in a certain neighborhood. Then she ends and says, people of color may also hold prejudices and discriminate against their own and other groups of color. But this bias ultimately holds them down and in this way reinforces the system of racism that still benefits whites. Racism is a society-wide dynamic that occurs at the group level. And when I say that only whites can be racist, I mean that in the United States, only whites have the collective social and institutional power and privilege over people of color. People of color do not have this power and privilege over white people. I thought this passage was just so powerful in a sense that I have many white friends that have expressed to me their thoughts around, Blacks being racist towards them. And on the surface, when you hear that, I think most people say, yes, we get it. And it may be because of ideas or notions or experiences that Blacks have had, Even me as a Black woman, there's times I've had to check myself, right? And I've had to say to myself, to make sure I don't show prejudice in people or a person just because I have been done wrong by a white person. It doesn't mean that everyone does that. And so I actually, when I read that, it resonated with me because I think that's an angle that sometimes maybe Black people don't even admit. But at the end of the day, she made the point that even if Black people may do this to themselves or to white people, we don't have the power. We don't have the power to make it institutional and to control people's lives with it. And I think that was the big takeaway from that, is just realizing we do not hold that same level of power and authority that you guys have, right? So, like I said, this book is full of a lot of things here, and it would take us all day to go through it. And there's one thing that I thought about that I wanted to cover is a surprise learning that I had. So even though I like to think I'm well versed in this area because of my experiences and my just interest to be informed about it, it still was some things that I learned here. And she talked about a term called good versus bad binary. And she said that this is something that many white people struggle with, right? And so on page 72, she has this list where she says in a white person's mind, they tend to equate racist with being bad. And they think of words or actions or feelings around being ignorant, bigoted, prejudiced, mean-spirited, old, and Southern. Those are the things that they associate with racist. And she said they tend to associate not racist with being good, right? That's why no one wants to be called a racist, right? You don't want to be seen as a bad person. And she said words like progressive, educated, open-minded, well-intentioned, young, and northern are the type of words that come to mind here. Now, I don't know how many of you may agree with that or even thought of that. So put in the chat if that's something that, anyone, Black or white, that you tend to think of when you think of racist, you think of those words, you think of not racist, you think of being good, and you think of the other words. And what she wrote here is, while making racism bad seems like a positive change, we have to look at how this functions in practice. Within this paradigm, to suggest that I am racist is to deliver a deep moral blow, a kind of character assassination. Having received this blow, I must defend my character. And that is where all my energy will go, to deflecting the charge rather than reflecting on my behavior in this way. The good-bad binary makes it nearly impossible to talk to white people about racism, what it is, how it shapes all of us, and the inevitable ways that we are conditioned to participate in it. If we cannot discuss these dynamics or see ourselves within them, we cannot stop participating in racism. The good-bad binary makes it effectively impossible for the average white person to understand, much less interpret racism. Is that something you guys agree with? What do you think about that? It's a lot said there, and it's very direct, right? And now it makes sense to when I think about certain conversations that I may have had with a white person when we're talking about racism, we talk about politics, like the defense and feeling attacked. Now I understand where that comes from. Even though in my mind, I didn't feel like I was attacking, I felt like I may have just been stating my opinion or stating something I observed, but now I can understand because of the construct of, you know, good versus bad around this, that they felt attacked. And even what's more clear is the bullet I have there about there are many pressures to collude. The foremost of which is that there are rewards for conformity with the system, right? If we behave in ways that the dominant group finds favorable, we will likely receive benefits or at least minimize penalties in our daily interactions with them. This is what she was saying, maybe in the mindset of white people who don't necessarily agree with their behavior, or even Blacks who are trying to fit in, right? Sometimes we're rewarded. We're rewarded at work if we don't make noise, if we don't cause problems, if we don't bring up things that are truthful and facts. We are rewarded. You know, and if you are viewed as a person who speaks up and makes noise and complains about things, even though you're telling the truth, you may not receive those same benefits. So because of that going on, it's pressures to collude and keep this going. Does that make sense to everyone? So in this book, the great thing is, like, 'cause she talks about a lot of different subjects, but what I like is that at the end, so she just didn't try to call people out or say what's wrong. She kind of talked about how we can do better, right? How can we do better? And she said, the primary goal for white people working to understand racism is not to learn how racism impacts people of color. That is not the goal here. We don't necessarily want you to just understand how it impacts us. But the primary goal is to recognize how the system of racism shapes our lives, how that system is upheld by the majority, and then try to understand how you might interrupt it. What can you do to interrupt it, right? And this is a poll question I would like Marshall to post. Do you think you have the power to enact real change? And this is for everybody, whether you're white or Black. Do you think you have the power to enact real change? And I almost wish it was kind of like a second part to this question where we could understand how maybe white people answer this question versus Black people, because I suspect we would see a difference there. But do you think you have the power to enact real change? Marshall, what does the results look like? Or Louise or Barbara, whoever is looking at them? Yes, okay, 67% said yes.
I think that was a different question though.
Oh, yep. It is a different question, sorry.
We changed that question.
Oh, it's okay, because we wanted to ask this question too. We wanted to ask, is your attitude and behavior towards others the same in public and private? So you guys answered 67% said yes, and 33% said no. And thank you for that honesty. So in the chat box, please answer the question about, do you think you have the power to enact real change? You can say a yes or a no, and we'll know it, that it goes to this. Because I did switch up the question on Marshall, I'm sorry. Sorry about that. But do you think you have the power? Because if you guys remember, I remember last year when, someone saying something? When the civil unrest was really at its height and heightened, and people would say, well, what can I do? What can I do? That was like a common question. And for me, the response was, start with yourself, right? Educate yourself on this matter. Start in your home. Pay attention to what you teaching your kids, right? Because I do think a lot of it is taught at a young age. And so for my friends that are non-people of color, I have always encouraged them to read about the subject, educate themselves, don't dismiss it, and think about their own actions, not just how they act when they're with me, right? But when they're with their other friends, and be that voice that when you see other people saying and doing things that you know aren't right or is not in line with how you believe, well, speak up about it, right? And that's some of the same things that Robin kind of put in the book, right? Pay attention to what you do in public versus private, and do you have authentic relationships with others, right? Because we've all probably heard someone that's a non-person of color say, well, I have Black friends, right? But is it an authentic relationship? Is it a professional relationship where you're just cool at work, you eat lunch together? Or are you really telling them things that's going on in your life? Are you telling them your business? Are they opening and sharing that with you? Are you really, really friends? Is that relationship real? And you really have to ask yourself that. And I think if you just look at the subjects that you guys discuss and talk about, I think you have the answer there, right? And then last thing that she says, or one of the things that she says, is to interact in community organization events with others that don't look like you. Because in the book, she pointed out how so many times people gravitate to groups that look like them, right? And I think that goes both ways because they may feel comfortable for whatever reason. But how about you get involved in an organization with people that don't look like you, but they're fighting for a cause that you believe in? That's a great way to start building the relationships and rapport there, right? And then one thing she talks about is for white people to embrace teachable moments. You're probably saying, well, what is that? What we're doing today, it's a teachable moment. Many of us have come to this table with different understandings or different thoughts. And even though we haven't went through all of the different topics in this book, a few that we've covered could be a teachable moment for you. I remember just this past summer, I went to Watson Glen because George Verdier, the president of the NAACP, was speaking at an event there. And I wanted to go show support. So me and another member from the church went, and we sat at a picnic table. And there was a woman walked over to us, a white woman. She was very friendly, and she came over and she said hi and introduced herself. And we began to talk. And when she sat down, the first thing she said is, so where are you ladies from? Elmira? So me being Dawn, I said to her, you know what? I said, we're about to have a teachable moment. And she looked at me and she said, a teachable moment? And then she said, what did I do wrong? What did I do? Did I say something wrong? So I said, why did you assume I drove from Elmira? There's other towns here. Why didn't you consider that maybe I live in Watson Glen? Why didn't you think I came from Ithaca or some of the other small towns, Corning, Horseheads? And she didn't say anything. She just looked at me. And I said, I know why you assumed I was from Elmira, because you make the assumption that that's where most of the Black people in the Southern Tier live, is Elmira. And she held her head down and she said yes. So for me, it wasn't about beating her up at that moment. It was truly about teaching her. And I said, I live in Horseheads. I don't live in Elmira. I said, but in the future, you have to be careful about that, about just making those type of assumptions and then even saying them. And I said, and I'm not mad at you. We're going to still sit here and we're going to talk and we're going to engage with each other. I said, but we needed to have this teachable moment right here. And she smiled and all was good. And then we moved on to another subject like nothing had happened. Right? So that's maybe not all Blacks would have dealt with it in that way. Maybe some might not have said anything. But for me, being who I am, I wanted to have that discussion with her, right? And even with working in police reform, we talk about so many subjects. Everything you see in the news, we talk about it at that table. And for me, sometimes it is it's hard on me emotionally, but at the end of the day, I am so thankful that the people sitting at that table with me, the chiefs, the sheriffs, the elected officials, feel like they can talk to me, feel like they can open up. And I'm glad that I feel that way. And maybe, you know, some of us having that military bond is at the root of that. I'm not sure what it is, but from the beginning, we always knew that we kind of maybe stood on different sides of different issues, but we made it a point to make sure when we come together, we're talking about what's real. Because at the end of the day, us 5 people sitting at that table, I'm the only woman, the only person of color. We kind of represent what's going on in this town, in this state, in this country around racism and just thoughts, right? And if we can't talk about it here to come together to make it better for the community, how can we expect others? So we all came to the table with that mindset and we made it okay. It's okay for you to say, I don't agree with this, or it's okay to ask a question, well, why is this? And we all did it. And I'm just so thankful for that experience. I'm thankful for those teachable moments, because there were times where they even taught me something, right? Teachable moments is just not about Black people teaching white people. It's about us teaching each other, right? And I think that's the end, and that's what I wanted to leave you guys with. If you haven't read this book, please go read it. There's a lot of good stuff in here. And if you were offended by anything today, you really need to read this book then, right? All righty, thank you. So we do have a little bit of time for discussion and questions. And Marshall, please make sure you save everything in the chat, because I was unable to see the chat during this session because I was sharing my screen. So please make sure you save it. And we do have a few minutes. We want to open up for comments or thoughts.
Yeah, so Dawn, I made some notes of what was in the chat just to get this thing started. And I'll go through this really quickly. In the video, there was a comment that pointed out the kids who were at the back of the line by the time all the questions were asked, just not even bothering to participate because they knew they couldn't do it.
Yep.
And that the video was met with a lot of anger and sadness but happy to have seen it and to see some understanding. The first question, which I think was about talking about race, there were some people who felt they were not necessarily afraid, but were certainly uncomfortable and also worried about being insensitive. So I think those are things that we need to acknowledge and get over ourselves. About talking in the home, there were a couple of comments about, yes, but those were negative discussions, not positive. And it was sort of an us versus them thing.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts on sort of the initial premise of the book was, whoa, that's hardcore. That when there was one, I was defensive at first, but as I read more, I really appreciated it. It was very eye-opening, in particular for someone who was who grew up in the South, a white person. Lots of unhappy, not pushing back, but just feeling bad about the good-bad dichotomy, and certainly acknowledging that, yeah, I don't want to be called a racist. Of course I don't.
Right.
In terms of the power of change, there were quite a few yeses. There were some nos. There was a sometimes, sometimes not. There were a couple only my own behavior. One said, I hope not. I hope the answer is not no. And then a comment about I need to start with awareness, or we need to start with self-awareness and then move on to the collective to try to change things on a broader basis. There was a comment that, yes, there are 47 people on this call. That's a teachable moment. And then there was also a comment from a Black person saying whenever sort of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter movement came up, white people were noticeably uncomfortable and wanted to change the subject. So now we'll get to the
So while you bring that up,
yeah.
I do have someone on the line who kind of was just working with me as I prepared for this and just encouraging me. And his name is Jamar. And I'm really thankful for Jamar because he's kind of like that person in my life that I may bounce things off, you know, certain subjects. And so he's on this line and he's in Texas. And I just wondered if he had any thoughts here that he wanted to share. I give you a moment. You can turn your camera on and just say hi. Because I just appreciate your support in this endeavor. Like I said, he's calling in away from Texas.
So can you unmute him if you?
Oh, yep.
You can unmute it.
I think Marshall has to unmute him. Or
Yep,
he has
he
to
does.
unmute. There
Yeah.
you go. Jamar, what are your thoughts on this book or anything you want to share? Anything, question, whatever.
I did want to kind of echo the words that you said earlier. It's really enlightening to come from the other side, right? And so I'm from Detroit. I live in Texas now. And so grew up in pretty much, like I would assume the majority in America, white people in America do, except the opposite way, where I was surrounded by Black people all my life. And fortunately, I had 2 white friends. And then my parents made a very stern point to put me in summer camps with white people. So because Detroit was not really indicative of the real America. And so coming from the other side, this book was really powerful because I always wondered, what is it like to be white in America, right? Because, you know, I know what it's like to be Black, and to give that kind of perspective that, hey, we also see things are wrong. It was really enlightening. It's really encouraging for me personally. And also a challenge to me to start being a little bit more vocal when I do see these things. I am guilty of being complicit and silent in a lot of atmospheres. And for those that know me, I'm trying to calm myself down that way, because in college I was not. A lot of people, I went to Grand Valley State. I was very vocal in college, and because of crossing that professional line, we tend to start being a little bit more complicit when we're in those atmospheres and arenas. And so I would have loved to have a more dynamic, get some viewpoints from like Barbara, Louise. I'm only saying your names because you're at the top of my brain. But I would have loved to get the perspective of some of the people that have read the book. I think that's some of the conversation is the teachable moment that you're saying, Dawn. It's like engaging in that conversation to be able to bring awareness and kind of shoot down some of the things that are considered stereotypes versus just your perspective may be a little different. And that book brings some of that to light. And it was a great read to me. And I appreciate the invite. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jamar.
So I have a couple of things in the chat. Someone suggested that people who are interested in this subject read Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Caste, where she really talks about institutional racism and sort of the all the different layers of that. There was another comment that the kids in the video, the kids at the back who did choose to race had to work twice as hard, which is, as we know, a fact of life for people of color in this country. I do have one personal comment. I found the book really interesting. And I guess I'm a little frustrated that it was written by a woman who's making a 7-figure salary teaching people about race and saying things that Black people have been saying for I don't know, at least the last 100 years. So, but if it gets her more of an audience so that people really start thinking about these things, I guess it's okay. It's just frustrating to me that a lot of this stuff is not new, as I'm sure people who
Can I ask you a question too, Louise? Because I actually had that exact conversation with my colleagues on the Black side, if you will, and to me, and I disagree with them. Mostly, they sound like you, that she's making a lot of money off of things that's been said by Black people for years. But my question is, has it been listened to? It seems like it's actually hitting home now that it's a book that's being said something from that side of the table. And if the goal is impact, does the monetary gains really matter as long as we're getting that impact?
Okay,
because I haven't had a conversation like this before.
Okay,
And I love it.
Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, I don't know. Is it working? I guess it's getting people to think. I don't know if it's helping things to change. And I guess I could have left a seven-figure salary out of that statement and said, okay, but people like James Baldwin and all kinds of other people have been telling us this for a very long time, and we have not been paying attention. So.
And that's my point. Like, pay her $1 trillion if I don't care,
Okay.
as long as the impact is coming, right?
Sure.
Because at this point, James Baldwin couldn't get the ears of anybody, right? Because he looked like me, but Robin DiAngelo looks like you. So, you know, she's now is being heard, right? That's the impact that we need. And so I hate that we're such a monetized society that we're going to, oh, she's making a lot of money off the backs of Black people. Well, she is, but now it's being heard, and that's what's most important.
Okay, so I do have a few things in chat here. I don't want to be dominating this. So Nanette, are you unmuted? I can do that.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Nanette Massey in Buffalo, New York. I just got braces yesterday, so you are witnessing me learning to speak over braces. I do a weekly Zoom discussion on white fragility. Look me up at NanetteDMassey.com. And I do hear a lot of people say, well, you know, I resent that a white woman is getting paid for all this information. What the thing is, though, what Robin's book does is it gives us a shared vocabulary that white people can relate to. And then what I do on Sundays is I tell stories from my life and I relate them to specific ideas in the book. And people go, oh, okay, I get it now. So I'm grateful, like Jamar said, I'm grateful to Robin for breaking it down into a language that it's like Robin translated racism into Spanish or something like that. So now we can have the same conversation. And I'm able to really, because of Robin's book, I'm able to take the discussion away from the good, bad binary and into the bigger picture of systemic racism and how each person, as a white person, and even Black person, how each of us participate in that system. And it's not about you being a good or bad person one way or the other. So I'm grateful like Jamar said, I'm grateful to Robin for giving us a shared language, so to speak.
That's great. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think you did put in the chat a link to your group, so people can look for that. And there's another suggestion in the chat, which is that there is a Facebook group called Be the Bridge that was started by Latasha Morrison that also talks about these issues. So if people are interested, they can look for that as well. Yeah, there's in the chat, the notion of shared vocabulary, people like that. The notion of translation, so that's terrific. Yeah, so if you're not seeing the chat, Nanette's group is www.nettedmassey.com. So I bet she'd love to have us join her on that.
I'll save the chat and I'll post it with the video on YouTube.
Okay, so the chat will be saved and will be available in the YouTube video, which will be at the library's YouTube channel. And I think it will also be posted at some point on Facebook.
A link.
Yes,
Sure.
a link to it. Yeah,
It'll stay on there.
yeah. Another comment in the chat that somebody had read How to Be an Anti-Racist and thinks it makes a good partner book to read. I can say I've also read So You Want to Talk About Race, which I found very helpful to me. So other comments or questions?
Louise? Yeah, I'll speak if I can.
Uh-huh. Oh, sorry, hang on. Yep.
Hi,
Um,
yeah, I'm unmuting and we just have to coordinate our computers here so we don't get a bad echo. I just wanted to bring up the letter from Birmingham jail, Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, and he brings up one of those things. It's a very subtle point. Again, you talk about good and bad, and he says, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderator who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in your goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow misunderstanding from people of good will is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. So I just thought that ties in with this as well, and it shows the subtlety of racism.
Okay, can we switch?
Thank you, Marshall.
You have to turn your volume off, though.
Would anyone else like to say anything? Louise, we want to
No,
make
it's
sure.
up. Okay, yeah, I put some further reading ideas in the chat. There's a link to the Corning Community College Black History Month events in the chat from Erica Underman. Thank you, Erica.
Hey, Louise, I see Connie had a comment. Connie, she had raised her hand. Did you want to say something? Connie Sullivan Bloom?
Yeah,
Hi, yes. May I? Is that okay?
yes.
Okay, great. Hi, Dawn. It's so good to see you, and thank you for doing this. Yeah, the thing that has struck me about this in that quote that Marshall shared, that famous Dr. King quote, and then in terms with combining that with white fragility, is that, you know, this moment in our history where white supremacists have really, you know, directed the conversation about race. And it's because, you know, it struck me just now that that's because white moderates, white, you know, the people that Dr. King was just describing there, that's me, right? And probably a lot of us in this Zoom, though maybe not all of us, we've allowed those white supremacists to hijack this conversation at this moment in our history. So I really feel, and we've done it historically over time, but I really feel like, you know, we have to be, I'm feeling like I need to be really responsible to that, because the way things are being framed right now in our culture are not going to get any better if if I don't make a stand about it, and if I don't get my friends and neighbors who look like me and have the same privileges I have to make a stand about it. So I just wanted to kind of express that, and thank you, Dawn, for moderating this conversation, because we're standing on a precipice right now. We need to do something.
Absolutely. Thank you, Connie.
Anyone else? Comments, questions?
Yeah, I have a comment. This is Michael Joseph. I think it's very true, Connie, what you said. And I think those of us who consider ourselves to be progressive, regardless of your skin color or orientation, you do need to have that dialogue. We need to have that dialogue amongst ourselves and not be afraid to cross certain lines. We need to have that common understanding so that we can have a viewpoint we can defend. The white supremacists, the neo-Nazis, the neo-fascist Trump supporters, they have a very clear understanding of what they stand for. So it's very easy to translate that. And we won't be able to fight it until we do.
Thank you, Michael.
So Barb McLean, do you want to speak, or do you want me to try to interpret your comment?
I can speak if you want. So when the author first brought up the term white supremacists, and of course, I think we all jumped to the picture of the alt-right, what Michael was just talking about, neo-Nazi, Trump supporters, whatever kind of thing. And then she went to define it further to be a more sort of general term. For me, because it's so emotionally charged now and used for that alt-right, I kept having to switch it from every time I read the term white supremacist to white superioritists, or I don't know what the grammar is there, but anyways, and I kind of would stop myself, like, is that the right things that I should be doing? I guess, part of this dialogue too, as a white person, is second guessing yourself all the time too. Like, if I do this, am I doing the right thing? And I'm not saying that in a defensive way. I'm not meaning to mean that defensive way. I just as trying to be more thoughtful, I guess. And I guess it's okay to be wrong and mess up and all that sort of thing, because it's all a learning process. But that was my sort of knee-jerk reaction when I kept reading, when she used the term white supremacist, to switch it out to white superioritists or something, to really understand what she meant by that. I don't know if anybody else had that reaction when you were reading that term in the book, or not.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's such a loaded thing now, even more. The notion of us all being white supremacists, what she means is we're all, benefiting. Yeah, or privilege. I don't know. So a couple of things no, somebody else should respond to that.
Well, let me offer this. I've read part of that book, not all of it, but I've listened to her videos, of which she has several. And she's saying essentially that you may consider yourself to be a liberal, a progressive, but if you don't make the concerted effort to make your view heard, the other more radical elements will speak for you. They're essentially speaking for you. And I think that is when people are faced with, well, does that put me in that camp of, these radicals? Now, I don't belong in that camp. I'm not a racist. I'm not, you can't equate me to a Klansman or a neo-Nazi. Well, if you say nothing, what do you expect? The same thing happened in Nazi Germany. And I've spoken to a few survivors, and a lot of people said nothing. And it was just too bad when they started loading the cattle cars. So let us not have that happen here. We cannot allow that to happen here. And some of us were quite concerned that it might well have if Trump's forces continued to grow and he got a second term.
So there is a suggestion in the chat in response to Michael's comments. Is there a way that we can keep this, the library can facilitate keeping this conversation going? I think that's a great idea, and maybe some of us offline could try to figure out what that might look like.
Absolutely. I'll work with you guys too. This has been a great discussion. And I just want to thank you guys for asking me to do this. I appreciate it. Like I said, I learned a lot too. And I just thank everyone that came out to support today's book reading. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. It was terrific. And I'm so happy. So those of you who are regulars here, and I've been bemoaning the fact that there was no comments and no questions in the first two books, Sandwich and Presentation. So I'm so glad that wasn't the case here. Thank you very much to everybody who participated.
All right.
All right. So
Thanks to the library for doing this, you guys. Thank you for taking this on.
Yeah, so I think, okay. Yeah, so I think we've gone beyond our time allotment. Thank you for everyone who stayed. We have 3 more programs coming up. If you want to sign up, you can go to the library website into the calendar and find the sign-up sheets there. Next week's presentation will be done by Louise Sullivan-Bloom, who presented so wonderfully The Power a couple of years ago. She'll be reviewing The Book Woman of Troublesome Creek, which is fiction by Kim Michelle Richardson. And its main character is a Kentucky packhorse librarian during the Depression, and I hope we have an equally robust discussion about that. So, anything else, anybody?
Good.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, John.
Bye.